Peter, give me 3 top tips for estate agents on choosing a great conveyancer.
The first one would be availability.
Okay.
I think it's absolutely essential that any lawyer that you're working with, lawyer, conveyancer, is always available. In other words, what I mean by that, has the time to give both to the client and to the agent, because as we all know, delays kill deals, and what dictates the success or outcome quite often of a transaction is the volume of cases that
I've been to some conveyancing firms and they're up there, but a lot of people say, well, if you shout loud enough, you'll get to the top of the pile.
Squeaky wheel gets the grease, and that is the problem that we see. I mean, I've employed a lot of people from these firms, dealing anywhere between about 80 to 150 cases. And I think the key, as we always say to agents, is that if you've got a lawyer, they always talk about communication, but it's always about how many cases is that lawyer working on.
Do you think that's a fair question to ask of a conveyancer? How many?
Absolutely. And people always get shocked when I talk to estate agents and say, how many cases do you think a typical conveyancer would be working on?
How many? What is the average?
Well, it varies. It depends on the types of firms. But certainly, if you're in a volume firm, I employed someone from a firm down in Kent. She was working on 150 cases.
Is that a lot?
That's a lot. 150 cases is a lot. I mean, we don't go above 55. And we have 2 full-time people on it. And these guys took another guy on from a place in the West Country. He was working on 200 cases between 3 of them. Yeah, that is a lot of cases.
So your ratio is 55 between two
people. Yeah, so we are considerably, we're about half what the national average is. And what that means is, and the result of that is, we get deals through more quickly. It's really simple. The more time you can spend on a case, the more time you can chase, the more time you can push. That's when I talk about availability. That's what I'm talking about, availability to do the work.
So that's a huge tip. Ask what the ratio is, and 55 between 2 full-timers, sounds like a pretty gold standard to me.
It's low. Yes, it is.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
What's the second top tip?
Make sure that any conveyancer that you're recommending has got good technology solutions in place.
What does that look like?
Anyone that has to rely on paper files, anyone that has to rely on the physical ability, the ability to look at physical documentation, is going to be slow. Ask whether they've got case management systems in place. It's relatively unusual still for people to have decent case management systems, so they're relying on paper files. The big problem with that, if the lawyer's not available, then other people don't have access to their files.
What about these solicitors that always insist that everything has to be done via letter or don't even know what an email is?
Yeah, I'd recommend avoiding those sorts of people. If they're smaller, they don't have a good grasp on technology, they don't use email with other lawyers, then we would certainly recommend, if you can, to steer people away from them. It will be slower.
Would you actually say, in terms of communication, what's the best way? We'll come on to number 3 in a second. What's the best way to communicate with a solicitor? Is it phone? Is it email?
We know that agents like using phones. However, what we've found has been more successful is where people use email. We've personally found that. And agents typically, they realise that it causes less interruptions. However, it doesn't mean that it does mean that you won't necessarily get an immediate response. Our personal opinion is the phone is always more efficient if you can speak to someone.
And what's the third tip for a choice of conveyancer?
Third tip is always recommend someone that you've worked with recently. We have a lot of people where they say, oh, we've worked with these people over the years. Things change all the time. People change, personnel change. And always look at, have I worked with them recently? What is their support like? Is it just a person on their own who happens to be really good? And that again introduces its own risk. But certainly recent experience and consistency. What was a good lawyer 6 months ago doesn't make them a good lawyer now.
Interesting. Maybe we could talk a bit more about these in future videos.
Absolutely.